All right, I'm Jack Beaton. I've been introduced, so I'll just move straight to the meat of it. I used to work at Nokia. I was there a year. I recently left. And while I was there, I did some research in India. That was about a year ago. I was there for about a month. And I was working mainly on finding out what happens when you introduce people who have never seen the internet, email, or the web before, anything like it. What happens when you introduce them to web services, specifically Nokia's web services? Now, the two projects we worked with were the OV Mail project and Nokia Life Tools. Now, we actually have in the room today the lead designer of OV Mail right now, who is Meiji Zeller, right here in the front. She is actually the person who, a hand please. Meiji's actually the person who requested testing on OV Mail, specifically with people who would be the most confused by it, which is a very daring thing to do, and this is the reason I went to India. So please appreciate Meiji for this. And when the presentation's over, you may direct any design or product questions to Meiji. I'll be able to take any questions on the content of the presentation, and things having to do with Nokia IP, neither of us can answer because a lot of this is very interesting, but we can't tell you about it. I'm going to tell you about the methodological results we did when we went to India, and we tested these. And we found that testing strategies in India are actually very different from what we'll have to use here. So our testing strategies were made in America and the West, think aloud and such. And when you bring them to India, things change. So let's begin. Okay, I really like this book, so I put it on every presentation I do about India. We are like that only. This is a very good description of India. India rewards attention. And if you do your research, things will go out well. If you don't, things might not. And so there's a really famous story which has become the poster child of research failure. It reached the front page of the Interactions magazine. I'm not going to tell you which company was involved, but they made a washing machine and relabeled delicate to sari cycle without ever putting a sari in the washing machine. Turns out it was a very efficient sari shredder, very highly powered sari shredder. And so the result was millions in losses, and things had to change. They took a long time to recover. But that's not my favorite story. My favorite story is actually what happened to Unilever, a company I will name because they came out very well. They were researching their sales of washing machines in India, and they turned out 70% of their sales were in Punjab, and thought this was a really high number. Let's move forward. Let's sell Unilever detergent in Punjab. But they found something. So they went ahead and they said, this is strange. Everything's in Punjab. Why not anywhere else? And they went there, and they found that actually the washing machines they were selling in Punjab were being remodeled to make lassis, which is a type of yogurt smoothie. It turns out that there is a tariff on certain types of blenders. And so as a result, the washing machine was the next best step. It was very cheap. And so whereas a different company was having great difficulty with its washing machines, another company had the satisfaction of being a washing machine company trying to sell detergent that knew in advance its washing machines were being used to produce delicious smoothies, which is very unusual for a hardware company. So in any case, when we went to India, we worked with a usability contractor called Kern Communications of Hyderabad. The person involved was Ripul Kumar, and so when I was there, we were working on the OV Mail and Nokia Life Tools testing. This guy was an absolute mine of information, and I wrote down everything I could about what he said. I thought it was very interesting. And in the end, we produced a paper on it, which will be in Georgia. So if you're in Georgia, please see me in the poster session. But now I'll go on, and everything I do further is going to be the content of this paper. So earlier researchers, Vatrapu and Paris Binonis, they discovered that having an Indian moderator, if you remove in an abstract way everything else, language, whatever, you're going to find that an Indian moderator with an Indian participant will get twice as much data as a Western moderator. Everything else abstracted away. And Ripul and I believe the reason is status. We believe this based on what we saw during the testing. Before I begin, I want to have a nice brief talk about cultural relativism because this is a sensitive subject. We're talking about status in a foreign culture, and as you've noticed, I'm a white guy. The original form of anthropology and ethnography was called ethnocentrism, which we call that now. It's basically the idea of let's use a coordinate system. We're 0, 0. We're normal. Everyone else is weird. And so this didn't last very long in an era of tolerance and civil rights. And so now we use the relativistic system. And so since we're all computer buffs here, the ethnocentrism would consider this to be a Europe object with some variables, an India object with some variables, whereas in a relativistic system, you really just have one block, which is the relationship, and you think, okay, there's a relationship between this group, and this is the change between them. What it also means is that in order to understand where you're going, you also have to know where you're coming from. Now, there's one problem with using cultural relativism, is that we are not above it. We are still subject to it even if we understand it, which means you will experience culture shock, which is what happened to me. At various points in India, I experienced things that I could not immediately understand, and I had to have a certain period to acclimatize myself. The Indian view of status is very different from the American system of status. And so this was visible by the fact that every time I experienced culture shock, which happened 3 times, and I'll show you this graph every time it happens when in this presentation, I'll describe all 3, my talkativity dropped severely for a period of 24 hours. And so for about 24 hours, very little came out of my mouth. I just couldn't talk. It was a physiological effect. And this is what happens when you have culture shock. Of course, this also means when you hit culture shock, you probably found something very important. So I'm going to be talking about all 3 of these things as we go. So let's start by talking about where we're coming from. We're taking think aloud testing and other techniques from a Western culture. We're trying to apply them to India. And we realize that actually, Western culture is actually pretty weird. And so there are several exceptions we need to know about, exceptions from norms. So for example, honking is an insult. And actually this here, it's actually blow horn. You'll find either blow horn or please honk on the back of nearly every truck in India, because in India driving rules, every time you move in or out of someone's blind spot, you should honk so they know you're there. This prevents accidents. The result is it's honking all the time. In America, that would be an insult. Another difference is staying silent is antisocial. So in America, we often try to fill silence. We feel really weird if someone isn't talking. We're worried he's going to go crazy or something like that. But in India, that's normal. If you don't know what you're doing or don't want to say anything, you simply sit. And the last thing, which is most interesting, will drive us to our next thing, is fair prices. This is a book that I really love by a historian called Beaton. And one of the things he says that many of us don't know about is that fair prices is a Western concept. It was propagated by the church during the Middle Ages. And it's really not shared by anyone else in the world. One of the qualities of this is that everywhere else in the world, people tend to charge, they want to charge according to your means. Whereas fair prices, you charge everyone the same amount, is basically, when you think about it, it's actually an automatic discount to rich people. And so if you're charging people according to your means, like in India and many other cultures, how are you going to do this? We don't yet have a system to automatically price bracket people by, saying, what are your assets? What does the IRS know your assets are? We don't have this yet. We might, but we don't. And so in normal human culture, how do you find out how much money someone has? You do it by eyeballing them. That's all you've got. And so this is where we come to status, which is going to be the subject of the rest of this talk. Okay, so in India, status is extremely important. Depending on what you look like, doors will be opened or closed to you. It can affect how you look, what gender you are, how old you are. And it basically gives you a hint, how much wealth does this person have? How important is this person? So the result is there's this keeping up with the Joneses effect. Now in America, we'll switch out our phones about every 2 years when our plan runs out. Whereas India, people tend to switch out every 6 months or sooner. And as a result, Nokia actually has a basic advantage here because we have a very wide diversity of phones which look visibly different to your friends. And so when you change your phone, everyone's going to know about it. Whereas a more culturally American phone like the iPhone, the difference between when you upgrade from an iPhone 3G to an iPhone 3GS is you get a compass app right here. And so it's very difficult to tell if a person has actually switched phones and gone up. So there's this constant implicit struggle to see who's the most current. And this is very important. Now we have this phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, and that may make it seem sort of, wow, it's the Joneses. Well, other people don't do that. But it's very important in India, and it's important to keep in mind because it does open and close doors. So I'm going to tell you about a story that exemplified this to me. When I was in India, we were in a small rural village. We've been doing research nearby. And this is a grain weighing machine. So people came to weigh their grain, sell their grain. And a woman who was weighing her grain, came up to me, and he brought her granddaughter over, and she asked me to bless her granddaughter. And that seemed very odd to me, but I did it, didn't want to cause any trouble, and I asked her, well, why? Why would I bless this person? It turns out that because I was a white person wearing, these sneakers and this leather jacket in India, I must be very wealthy. And in the Indian mythology, of course, there's reincarnation. Our Western mythology comes ultimately from the Egyptians, which is you live once, then you're in the afterlife, and that's it. Well, in a reincarnation cycle, depending on how moral you are, you may be rewarded later in future lives, which meant that because I appeared wealthy, I must have been morally good at some time in the past, which meant I have the power to bless people. And this really shocked me, because this is very different from the way I was, I didn't expect to laugh then, but This is very different from what we're used to in the West, what I'm used to. And so I really didn't speak very much for the next 24 hours, which was good because we had Indian moderators for all the testing. So now here's the list of status indicators we assembled. There's more in the paper, but these are the ones we're full specified and I ended up writing down. And I'm going to go down this list and I'm going to tell you about them. Now that's a plus. I'm only going to say what the plus is. I'm not going to say what the minus is. Education, including how to use an interface, that's the big one. That kills think aloud. There's international, age, English fluent, clean, expensive clothes, and if you are male. Now here's the moderator in the middle. And so, of course, the best thing you want is you want people to be roughly the same as the moderator. I'm sorry, I didn't realize there were this many people here. It's at the bottom. But there's a moderator here, down here, a little moderator figure. And what happens is, if a person thinks they're higher status than you by a certain amount, they'll begin to take control of the session. So it's like, I ask the questions. No, 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 no. I'm not thinking aloud. If anyone's thinking aloud, you're thinking aloud. I'm going to do this interface, and you sit and you wait. Whereas, you lose control of the situation. Whereas, if the person thinks they're too low status and they're way below, they just won't say anything because they're afraid of getting scolded and doing something wrong. And so you want to try to meet them right along this line. You want to make sure they think they're just about equal with the moderator, so they're a peer. Unfortunately, think aloud depends on us forcing people into situations where they mess up. And education really includes how to use an interface, because in India, products are very rare. You're very lucky to have it, which means that you can't just buy another if it doesn't work for you. And so as a result, what usually happened during the testing is they'd go, 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 go. First breakdown, all thinking aloud would stop. It would just clam up. There'd be silence. And the moderators had a great difficulty drawing the participant back out or even bullying them out to try to get information on it. It was really excruciating to watch, honestly. And so we began to think, how can we deal with this? Well, as it happens, Apollo Chavan has made a technique that's now very famous now, Bollywood Technique. It's probably the most famous, unformally, like not formally published usability technique anyone's ever heard of. And basically the idea is, with an Indian audience, you say, hey, here's a plot from a movie-type plot. You're going to pretend to be this character. You're this guy. Now, not only is that a lot of fun, it also deflects any blame for problems on this guy. If you click the wrong button, you didn't do it. This guy's an idiot. I mean, and so as a result, it fixes situations. Oh, whoops, there's one more thing I wanted to say about this, which is that it does have the bad effect that they are, in fact, pretending to be someone else during the testing. And this does have a certain effect. So, for example, in the email testing, we had people make emails for themselves. They actually made it the first email account they've ever had. It was a Nokia email account. We had introduced in the internet, and they made it. I'm not going to tell you what they were, but I will tell you that if we were doing this, they would have made the email account of this guy. So the result is you actually end up collecting less open-ended data, even though it's a more valid think aloud version. However, to be specific, as we all know, think aloud is not meant to be an open-ended technique anyway. So it's really a situation where you sort of have to bite the bullet. Yes, you do need a two-stage testing process where you do your open-ended research and then you do your closed-ended research. In India, this is really your best bet. International, I've already talked a bit about that. We also had another situation where if you're in testing, be sure to hide in the back room. If they even see you, they will be quiet. We had a situation where there was this white Finnish guy at Nokia who was supervising some testing, and he really wanted to sit in, and so he sat in, and there was silence, just dead silence, because the participant went all the way over to the right, this international guy here. And so during the testing, we basically had to hide in the back room for a week. It was pretty excruciating. But age, okay. This is a really interesting chart. I'm not going to tell you what they were doing. I'm not going to tell you what they're doing. I'm only going to say these are people who had never done this before, seen the internet for the first time. They're doing something involving the internet, web services, and this is what we got. And these are ages up across the top. And so you'll notice something really interesting here. So this we expected. This we sort of saw coming. This makes sense. This didn't really make sense. Why did they fail? They're the youngest people. We'd expect the youngest people would succeed. However, because they're younger, they'll not be as good at plugging the moderator for information about the device. What ended up happening is they'd have this first breakdown, then they'd stop thinking aloud, and then be trying to get hints out of the moderator so they didn't have a second breakdown. Now, the moderators were actually in this age group. And so what we realized was we think that the reason this hump happened was because this age group is in the sweet spot of knowing enough technical knowledge to get through the interface with help from the moderator, because they can plug them for hints. But the younger participants were not as effective at getting hints out of the moderator. So actually the increased age was having an effect on the younger participants. The moderators were giving more information out through hints. And so if you can, try to get someone from the same age group as your moderator for the participants. If you can't, remember that this will have an effect on your results. English fluency. Oh dear. Okay, so the first thing to remember is, why is this English fluency? Why aren't we talking Hindi fluency? What's so great about English? And so here's a language map of India, and here's a language map of Europe. And so what you'll notice is that if it wasn't, like historically, if it wasn't for the British, many of these would be separate countries. Really, India and Europe are pretty much, in a manner of speaking, analogous. These places, many of them were separate kingdoms, separate cultures. We might even consider them separate nations today, but because the British unified it forcibly, they're sort of stuck with each other. One of the results of that is outsiders like ourselves often go into India thinking, oh, this is a Hindi-speaking country. Well, yes, they do learn it in school, but really Hindi is not the majority language, it's the largest minority language. And this is sort of an analogy to Germany being a very large language group in the EU. It's a very big language group and it's very important. But you don't want to go to France and tell someone German is his mother tongue. It's a really bad idea. And so what this means is that maybe they don't want to learn Hindi. If they're going to learn a second language, for example, if they're from down here, where Bangalore is, they probably want it to be English and spend their time on that. The other reason is because English has a very strong, so we've already established English has a very strong connotation with your level of education. And we had an incident where we were asking people about the languages they were using on the interfaces of their phones. I'm not going to tell you why or what we learned, but I will tell you, we asked a person why he was using English on his phone and he didn't understand it. So he didn't speak or read English, but he had it on his phone. We want to know why. Ripple asked him why in Hindi. However, the phrasing of his question made it sound like he was wondering, well, he was accusing him of not understanding English. The person became very irate. Now, of course, the discussion was in Hindi, and Hindi speakers are often very respectful by American standards. So I was sitting here, I think everything's fine, you know, they're having this conversation. Actually, the man was threatening to punch Ripple in the face. And so he was very insulted by this statement, this question, which sort of implied that he didn't, like, what are you? What, do you think we're illiterate here? You know? Now, the truth was the man was probably extremely literate in Hindi, but really it was English that mattered to him. Now, clean, expensive clothes. This is another one. We were all in indoor. This is the same place as the punching incident. We were trying to do a street survey in an inner city, lower status area, lower income area. And so we wanted to ask questions. What about? I'm not going to say. But we can say what happened. We were trying to get information and we got nothing. Because, of course, we were over here and we hadn't dressed for the occasion. It's normal. At Current Communications, what you do is you come in dressed according to the people you're going to meet. And so you have very dull clothes or very bright clothes and many gold bangles, depending on who you expect to see. And they hadn't changed their clothes. So they weren't wearing their rundown clothes. They were wearing their very nice clothes, which clashed with the local area. And so the result was a man came up to us and he said, in Hindi, which I couldn't understand, Ripple translated, but he said, look, India is a great country, but this is a dirty area. You don't belong here. Your area is a mile in that direction. We had to leave. And this was very shocking to me, because he was, in fact, describing his area of town. We don't usually expect people to do that here. And so I thought, it was like, what, it's your own area. You can't say this. And so I didn't talk for another 24 hours. The final thing is male gender. This helps. And so the reason I know this is because there's another person who, also a former Nokia person, she left to go to the Copenhagen Institute of Design. Her name is Shruti Ramia. She is Indian. Her family's actually from Indore. And we were doing a street survey nearby Indore. And the way we did it, the research design was we didn't want to intimidate them, but at the same time we wanted Shruti to have enough respect. So she dressed in more drab clothing, and she went out to do the street survey, and I sort of followed back here, which is convenient because I had no idea what I was doing anyway. I can't speak Hindi with a word. And so she'd be in front, and she'd ask the questions. And here we were in this rural town. This is sort of a very badly drawn map of town. You could clearly see this comes from the PowerPoint auto shapes. But in any case, so we wended our way, and we asked a bunch of different questions along the street surveys, went through town, had a couple cops there. We asked them questions. Then we hit here where there's a cobbler's shop. And then everything just went straight to heck. Because what had happened was there was this man there, an older man in a nice clean shirt on this really shiny motorbike. And she asked him a question. And he took it this way. He's like, who are you? Who are you to come to our village and ask us questions? Who are you? And he actually called around, he actually called around everyone else in this sort of circle of shops here, who basically began mobbing us, me and Shruti. And so Shruti would basically say, Jack, we've got to get out of here, you know, and so we beat a hasty retreat. But up until then, everything had been going fine. Everything was going fine until Shruti, who is literally trying to be lower status, to be at the appropriate level for all the other participants, and all the questions went perfectly fine. We had a lot of data. But once we hit the one person, the richest guy in town, everything, it was a complete clash. If I had asked the question, maybe it would be different. We don't know. And the final thing that to talk about is in the waning days of the trip as we were back, Shruti mentioned, you know, Jack, you're an incessant talker. Boom. That was pretty hard. And so being as I'm an incessant talker, let's open it up for questions. Yes. Yes. She's from Indore, yes. Why?
So Shruti, I think, supposedly knew the traditions of India. So why could that asking the Richmond problem still have happened? And do you think that could possibly have been avoided?
It probably could have been avoided if I wasn't an idiot. I was basically walking behind her. I was sort of her research mentor in this situation because she's by profession a designer, not a researcher. And so I had her ask questions to everyone along this route without exception. This is something researchers have to do. And so as a result, I basically forced her through it. And so we both ended up having an interesting situation. But I will point out that being a researcher, you should expect to be killed at least several times during your career if you're doing your job. So it was very stressful, and it was mainly, I really caused the problem here. She really understood what she was doing and who we should and shouldn't. But, you know, it was part of the job, and so we did it.
From you, this could possibly happen.
Probably, yes. I believe she did. Oh. Well, yeah. Okay, next question.
So how much of what you learned do you think is specific to India, and how much would generalize to other countries?
Hard to say. It's really hard to say. So we know that status is important in literally every country and culture in the globe, I mean, in the world. It's hard to say. I will say that compared, I think it may be because of the reincarnation cycle part of it. That's one thing that India has that many cultures don't have, at least as strongly. And so status may be stronger in India, but I honestly can't say. I can only tell you that, you know, relatively speaking, the West to India, making that one jump, the sort of thing that people wouldn't blink twice about in a user test with an American moderator and an American participant, would cause immense changes in a user testing, the amount of data you could get and the validity of that data and user testing session between with an Indian participant.
So what are some of the implications from what you learned that applies to the interface, the email interface, or the cell phone interface specifically?
I'm going to be really, 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 really blunt and tell you that I can't answer that question. I can talk to you about methodology, but a lot of the data we got is extremely exciting, but it's secure to Nokia. I mean,
But without going into the specifics, can you illustrate the, let's say the principle?
The principle of some sort.
Yeah, the kind of differences. You alluded early on to, like the wash machine being used for making yogurt drinks or things of that nature. But I'm trying to get a sense of,
in general,
the kind of insight that you got.
A very general insight. Try to skipping around because I know exactly how I'd answer this question if I could say whatever I wanted, but I can't. The general way I'd say this is, Indians will find a use for nearly anything they can afford that will get them someplace. They will find a use for it, not necessarily the one you thought, but they'll find a use for it if it reaches their price point. And so for the internet, they may not understand it, but they'll come to learn it, particularly because the ability to use the internet will boost them up in terms of status, the ability to be able to do this stuff. And so one of the problems we'll have is that people will not understand things that are new to them. Well, we knew that. And so it's really up to us to make a division when you're looking at web standards. Which things are we going to focus on as being things where, yes, we'll change how we do the web for this person? Or which things are things we want to say, they're going to have to learn. And when they do learn, they'll be very happy to have done so, because this will create a difference between who they were previously and who they are now, and they'll be very proud of that. So you have to, the only thing I can say is go there, test, find out what they do and don't understand. And among the things they don't understand, think about what they're willing to learn and what you may want to change for them, without creating a whole new, gated garden of the internet just for India. So we have two over there.
I'll ask my question and then I'll pass the microphone back. When I was in Japan, one of the things I was surprised about, which fortunately is less true today, is that technology for men was considered more important than technology for women, and so a lot of the men had the latest gadgets, and the washing machines, you had to fill them with a hose and drain the water and then do it again. It was just a very low-tech system. Did you find anything else, either gender or caste or?
I will say one thing about gender. We had this really interesting incident when I was at one of the rural towns, and there was an internet cafe, and there were some men in the internet cafe, and I was buying plane tickets because I was dumb enough not to have got my plane tickets yet, and it was the last minute. It was typical Jack. But in any case, I was in the internet cafe, and a bunch of guys in the internet cafe, and a girl, a young woman, came by and wanted something from one of the guys in the internet cafe. He gave him like a piece of paper or something like that. But when this exchange happened, she didn't set foot in the cafe. It would have been faster if she'd walked halfway in and he'd stood up and handed to her, and she walked back halfway out. But she wouldn't step foot. He had to stand up and go to the entrance. And so there's a big difference between like female areas and male areas. And this isn't even really an India thing. This is like a world thing. And so there's an interesting anecdote I have about that, but I'd like to answer his question first. I'll get to it there.
I just saw that a lot of research is done for rural India. If there was any research done for semi-rural or urban India, and what was your target population for the product?
For this, I mean, strictly speaking, I guess Meiji could speak to this better, but
there were two projects that got me there for. One of them was email, and email is email address from at.com, email address to, and it was available on devices, so there's
Yeah.
Our study was located in the cities, right?
Yes.
The other project was
Yeah, Nokia Life Tools was so OVMail was more urban. Nokia Life Tools was more semi-rural and rural. And so we tested for OVMail. We did all the testing in Hyderabad, India. For Nokia Life Tools, it was a variety of rural and semi-rural towns. There, around Hyderabad, which is Telugu, and then further north near Indore, which is Hindi. And so we do have this. We do have this. Although, I mean, really, the Nokia philosophy, because with services, with products, you can say, okay, I'm going to sell this to you, and then you'll resell it to someone else, someone else, and someone else, and it'll eventually get to them. But I'll only deal directly with you. Whereas with services, you need a direct relationship with literally everybody. And so the result is we're trying to push into these areas where we know they won't. This is going to be the first time use. And so it was really first time use for both OVMail and Nokia Life Tools. And within the first time internet use population, it was urban for OVMail and rural for Nokia Life Tools.
So first of all, great talk. Thank you. I wanted to ask, essentially what I take from your talk is you're using, I'll call it Western research techniques in a different culture. And what I was wondering is you were working with someone who is native to India, if I understand it correctly, as a researcher there.
Yes.
So are there Indian techniques that we don't know about or that are different than here? And let me further it. For example, here we might do focus groups and they might not work at all in India, I don't know, because of the status and so forth. So are there other things that they do? I'm just trying to get some sense of when they do research, what does it look like?
Well, the Bollywood technique I would consider an Indian technique. It was made by Indians for Indians. It's something that, honestly, when I was at Carnegie Mellon, I mean, we heard about role play, but we never actually heard about pretending to be a movie character. So I would consider this a very Indian technique. In terms of other techniques, it's really hard to say. I mean, there's this massive balance of power in publishing, which is slanted so far against every other culture in the world but the West. It's often hard to get anything back. So, for example, with the Bollywood technique, it's this incredibly well-known technique, very famous. A lot of people have heard about it. A lot of people are using it. Yet there's really no conference papers on the ACM Digital Library about it yet, which is, when you think about it, a real disaster because it's extremely important. But this is nonetheless the way it is. And so there's this immense balance, which I feel has shifted in such a direction that it's actually sort of impeding science right now. So I'm pretty sure, yes, I'm sure there are Indian techniques. Bollywood technique is definitely one of them. But at this point, it's really hard to find the others. And so there really more attention needs to be paid to what all these Indian researchers, of whom there are many and very talented people in India making this stuff.
So what I hear is that one of the points you brought up is that people should be the same age and sort of status when doing the testing.
Roughly.
So for like user groups, I mean, right away when you walk in with someone who's a user experienced researcher, they're automatically ahead. So that probably takes immense amount of energy to get that group going and synergized because they're dealing with that barrier.
Oh, you mean if the
social status?
If the person who walks into the room and does all the focus group or the testing or something is already a user experienced person?
Right.
Yes.
Right away, they've got the education that.
Yes, enormous. And so the best practice is to make sure you have locally hired people. And so, which is normal for Indian culture. It's very normal. Whenever you need anyone, you hire them immediately. It's a very dynamic economy, much more dynamic, I would say, than our own, where hiring is this very stilted process. And so, as a result, when I was there in India, at Kern, they were very well staffed with all these, with people who they'd apply to many different purposes. And so the result was that the worst case scenario was that I would be doing the moderating user test, which, thank God, never happened. We always had someone who's very talented and ready to do it. There's a very large supply of very talented Indian researchers for us to hire and employ.
So
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, can you say a couple of ways that, when that user researcher went in there, they already have that status up, how they, their participants?
Well, I mean, one bonus they had was that a lot of the researchers, testing isn't very well known in India. And so as a result, people they really didn't know what they were there to do. And they weren't, at first, very intimidated because it's basically like, well, you're going to pay me some money and I'm going to use a phone? That's a great deal. And so they sat down and they started out very positively. We never really saw that boundary. We never really, I never really observed that, although I could definitely see it happening if you had a developer, interface designer, a researcher such as myself, someone with a master's degree or something like that going in there and advertising, hey, I'm this really nifty guy, let me ask you some questions. That would be a very bad way to start. Did you?
How did the cultural differences affect your interpretation of the data? You can talk about that.
My interpretation, okay, so the first and foremost effect was that I can't speak Hindi, so I could only really review half of the results, the English results. And so what ended up happening is we had Kern do a report on, like, a basic report on both the Hindi group and the English-speaking group, and then a more detailed one on the Hindi group. And I observed the testing, although I didn't really understand what was going on, and they tried to walk me through it. And then I did all the deep analysis on the English group. We were using Ori. And so I think that, in terms of biases, my own cultural biases, yes, absolutely they're there. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made this presentation. I wouldn't have had 3 moments of culture shock. I wouldn't have thought this was even important. So I know the biases are there, but I'm the guy who made them, and so I'm sort of the last guy to be able to know more about them, I'm afraid. You probably yourself already know more than I do about this presentation where you sit, unfortunately. But that's sort of the thing you have to do when you're a researcher. Yes?
Thanks. This has been very interesting and very thoughtful. I've recently been in a situation in which designers were talking about how they do design research, and I discovered how little I understood. And I'm wondering about sort of paradigmatic ways of finding things out and what the right way is to do things. In the West, we test our products. I've done that. You're on a mission to do that. Is testing the right concept in India? Is there an Indian concept or a regional Indian concept that we should be thinking in terms of and learning from, which would tell us the limits of our own sense of testing, as well as, of course, what very interesting people do in a very interesting other place from here?
I think there can be. I think that the Indian form of testing might be so different, like the ultimately evolved Indian form of testing may be something that we wouldn't even regard as testing. That's very possible. But at least for the near future, given how much low-hanging fruit we have, as you saw with the incredible Sari Shredder, just sending someone over there to just go kick some tires and talk to people, they'll already identify major costly problems that can be easily fixed. And so for now, testing is going to be very effective, and it's a technique we have. But in the future, yes, I do expect a natural evolution towards Indian-developed techniques that Indians will use to make interfaces for Indians. Yes?
Jack, 2 questions. One, would it have been worth it for you to learn Hindi?
Yes, it is. Yes, okay, so the first thing you do before you go to any culture in the world is you could go online and order Pimsleur's language training. There are these tapes. They're the best in the business. I should have done that in advance. I didn't have time to. It was basically, Jack, welcome to Nokia. You're going to India, which is sort of the way Nokia does business. It's a very dynamic company. But yes, I would definitely say there was a lot to gain in me learning Hindi, and I didn't learn enough before I got there.
Second question is, did you learn anything that you would bring back to even testing in America?
Yes. The Bollywood technique, I think, could be used in any culture in the world. I think we can use it here. I think that if you are combining open-ended techniques with think aloud like you should, and we aren't, and we sometimes, I'll be the first to say this, sometimes think aloud gets used because it's the only thing you have time for, and you end up it being your open-ended technique. Let's hope they say something during the test so we know. If you do the proper job and you have an open-ended stage and a closed-ended stage, I think that in the future, maybe that role play is the think aloud we end up using. It's hard to say. It's really hard to say. You make open-ended to make your personas. They role play to the personas. Maybe. I don't know. But I think that's what might happen. Oh, that was the chef. That was the chef raising his hand. I'm sorry. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. That was incredibly interesting. So thank you very much for coming.